Welcome to the 24th Annual Miami Jewish Film Festival, one of the world's largest and oldest Jewish cultural arts events. First, we'd love to acknowledge all of our members, our sponsors, community partners, and volunteers, and all of you film lovers, of course, and especially our presenting sponsors, SAGE, the Center for the Advancement of Jewish Education, and the Greater Miami Jewish Federation for their continued support all of these years. My name is Vanessa Ressler, former SAGE board member and active community volunteer, big film fan, and the founding director of Temple Beth Shalom's youth choir, the Shalom Rockers. I'm so honored and excited to be moderating a virtual conversation today with Dr. Alan Bern from the Young Kadyas. Alan, thank you for joining us from across the ocean today.
It's my pleasure and honor. Thank you, Vanessa.
Awesome. So I guess we'll just dive in. I've done a little bit of research about you on my own, but for the audience that hasn't yet had that opportunity, can you tell us a bit more about yourself and your background and then how you found yourself living full-time in Berlin, running this incredible program we see through the film Young Kadyas?
Yeah. Well, I was born in 1955 in Bloomington, Indiana, and my father was born in what is today Moldova, Bessarabia. My mother's family comes from around Lviv, in today Ukraine. And Bloomington, Indiana is a wonderful university town with an incredible music school and great university. And I was raised to basically be a classical pianist. And that's the route that I was on. And then came the Beatles and the 60s. And anyone who can remember the late 60s will remember that the whole feeling of culture was that everything got turned on its head. And it felt like a very, very exciting, very meaningful time. And I went with that flow, to put it briefly. So I continued playing classical music, and I still do to this day. I'm a composer. I actually have a doctorate degree in classical composition. But I got very interested in, let's call it, people's musics of different kinds. First of all, in Bloomington, Indiana, country and western music, and then jazz, and then from that, free jazz, and then from that, in Eastern European folk music. And in the middle of that, I ran into Yiddish music in around the year 1978, not realizing at that point that my mom and dad had sung Yiddish music to me and played Yiddish music to me when I was a kid. It took me some time to remember that. So this was at the beginning of what we sometimes call the klezmer revival, with bands like the Klezmer Conservatory Band and Brave Old World and Andy Statman and the Klezmatics. And some of your viewers will know that we played together with Itzhak Perlman in the middle 90s in Miami, among other places, and made a couple of wonderful CDs with him. So there was this wonderful energy going on in Yiddish music at that time. But parallel to this, I was always interested in Jewish history, Jewish life, and in a very, very general way in issues of what is a democracy, and how do we know when we're living in a democracy, and when are we in danger of losing our democracy? And in the middle 80s, I had been reading a lot of very interesting books. There's a book by a fellow named Ernst Mayr, which is called They Thought They Were Free, which is about the experience that people had in Germany in 1933 as the Nazis came to power, and step by step, the culture became more and more fascist. And as you can tell from the title of that book, they thought they were free. It wasn't until they were in the war that they realized how bad things were. And ever since I was a child, I grew up. I have family, my parents' family, both sides of the family, who died in the Holocaust. Of course, when you know that when you're a child, you think all the time about, would I have known what was going on? Would I have gotten out with my life? Would I have saved somebody? If I had a best friend, would that person have saved me? I mean, it raises all the basic questions of social life. What can you count on, and whom can you trust? And at a certain point, I felt like I had read enough about this and seen all the films about it and experienced it from a distance as much as I possibly could. And I decided I'm going to just take a big deep breath and grit my teeth and go visit Berlin. and that was 1987. And Berlin in 1987 was felt like paradise to me. And I was surprised because it's not at all what I expected. And actually, one of the first things that happened, this will be really surprising to your viewers, it's kind of an untold part of the story of Yiddish music revival, is that the third or the fourth day I was here, I was at a concert of Greek music, and a fellow came up to me at this concert and said, "Aren't you Alan Byrne?" It's like, "I'm in Berlin. How does this person know me?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Well, my name is Andreas, and I have started a klezmer band, and the one recording that we're using has you on the cover with a klezmer
Oh,
conservatory
wonderful.
band, so I recognize you. And we have concerts all summer. Would you like to play with us?" Wow, I mean, to go to a foreign country and Berlin and think that you're going to encounter your worst nightmare about German culture, and the third day you're there, somebody invites you to play all summer with them in the coolest clubs in a klezmer band. It can get a lot worse than that. So I said yes to that, and it was basically the beginning of my getting into not only Jewish culture in Germany. In the 90s, I got very active in composing and directing for theater here. And yeah, briefly, at the end of the 90s, I was invited by the city of Weimar to come and do a festival there for a week. And that's kind of common. I mean, there are festivals in New York and Montreal and Toronto and Kiev, and I mean, I could go on and on. So I didn't think more of it than that. Just, I'll be there for a week and that's it. But actually, there was a follow-up to that. And in the years after that, they gave me the opportunity to really build an organization there. And that organization has grown larger and larger every year. And at a certain point, it became a summer festival that goes for 6 weeks. Plus, we wound up getting a building, a 5-story old brick, old beautiful school building, to be a basic cultural center for our work. And I created out of this something which is called the Other Music Academy. The abbreviation of that, OMA, is a little bit of a play on MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art, but it's also the word in German for grandmother, the Oma. So, so for the German or for the Yiddish speakers here, you can imagine having a cultural center which is called, the grandmother, which is called, Buba.
Seems very appropriate, actually.
Yeah, became very appropriate. And really the mission of the Other Music Academy is to be a platform where people from all walks of life can come to meet each other, lose their fear of each other, and gain more knowledge about themselves. And that's what all of our projects are about.
That's great. So you've started to kind of answer my next question, which is what projects preceded this. But let's go a little bit deeper into that and try to make our way to how you came up with the idea specifically for this camp, bringing these groups of young women together. As you're alluding to, the program that's featured in this documentary really is like the tip of the iceberg in all of that you're involved in. So can you talk to us about the journey that created this program that we're seeing in the movie, but also the connections between it and Yiddish Summer Weimar?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. Well, within a few years of my doing this workshop in Weimar, I realized that people who were coming to this festival, whether they were Jewish or not, they had big questions. They weren't coming like you might just take a cooking class. I know people sometimes take cooking classes because it's the most meaningful thing for them in their lives. I love cooking myself. But the people coming to this workshop, they had maybe grandfathers and grandmothers who had been in the war, or who had survived, or who had been communists, or who had been Nazis, or who had been Jews. And to come to a place where it was okay to talk about those things and okay to find out about other people's experience was very, very compelling. It created a compelling emotional, social environment for everybody. And that was the kind of work that I was very interested in doing. I mean, again, going back to the 60s and the idea of peace work, I was always interested in that. And so the idea of Yiddish Summer of Weimar quite early was, rather than presenting Yiddish culture or Yiddish music as something which is just in a package that you can present over and over again, each year the festival has some central questions. And I bring together artists and scholars and historians to try to work on that question. And they're working on that question, which sometimes doesn't arrive at answers. Sometimes it just asks more questions, is the heart and soul of the festival that year. And all of the people who come to the festival are invited to participate in this process in some way or another. That can be very low level involvement, which is just sitting and listening, enjoying what's going on, or it can be a more intense involvement of contributing your own experience. So in what year was it? I can't remember. I think around 2014, 2015, I met a great, great Iraqi Jewish musician living in Israel. His name is Yair Dalal. And we began, he's exactly my age, and we began comparing experiences with each other. And it turned out that he, coming from Iraqi Jewish heritage, and I, coming from Eastern European Yiddish Jewish heritage, we had very similar experiences with our identities and our heritages vis-a-vis the larger society that we were living in. Because, you know, in the United States in the 60s, it was all about, now we're oriented towards Israel and we're not looking at the past anymore. You know, that's the culture of grandma and grandpa, and we're moving forward. And it turns out that for Iraqi Jews, and they came in the tens of thousands to Israel in the 50s, very similar thing happened. They were basically asked to forget the culture that they grew up in, to stop talking Arabic, and to become part of larger Israeli society. And as we began comparing these experiences, I thought, wow, there's a whole other story here that I've never considered about being a Jewish minority, and not only a Jewish minority, but a Jewish closest cultural affiliation is with Arabic culture. Think of that, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the language that he grew up in his home, that was the language of, you know, his mama Lashon, was Arabic. And if you think of that for a moment, it reframes the idea of friend and enemy and culture and all of this sort of thing. So I have had the feeling for a long, long time that political conflicts often sit on top of cultural similarities, shared cultural roots. And the political conflicts are brighter and louder, and they're in your face. But if you can go underneath that, you'll often find a level where the parties that are ostensibly in conflict with each other actually share a lot in common. So I asked Yair if he would like to help me for 2 years create a program called The Other Israel in the context of Yiddish Summer of Weimar, and he said yes. And this Kadya Choir project was one of the projects that we did in that framework, involving bringing young Israeli girls, both Arabs and Jews, and among the Arabs, both Christian Arabs and Muslim Arabs, together with European girls.
So why did that then, that particular project, become the focus of this film?
Well, we document all of our projects. So actually every project that we've done, and we've done dozens of them, have gotten some form of documentation. But the filmmakers who were interested in this project just fell in love with the project for obvious reasons. I'm in a state of withdrawal that I'm not together with those people. It was an unbelievably deeply moving experience to meet these young people and see how they negotiate the issues of their lives, and for them to open themselves up to music that I composed and give that music their whole heart and soul. That was incredible. And so these filmmakers said, Alan, a little documentary about this is just not enough. We want to make a full length film, and you know, let's go look for the funding and let's make this film. And I said, yo, of course, wonderful, let's do that.
That's great. So actually, you started to kind of dip your toe in the waters that I wanted to go into in a minute, which are,
Okay.
let's talk about the girls' experiences a little bit, if we could. Were you at all surprised by the depth of the conversations that these teens were having? Some of what you captured with these young women, for example, I mean, this is just one example of many. At one point, one of the girls said, "I don't feel Jewish, I feel Yiddish." I found profound, really profound ponderings about identity and self-definition, about otherness, about finding connections. Can you talk about any interactions that you had with these girls that gave you pause?
I found every conversation that I had with them to be wonderful. And I found them all to be extremely thoughtful. The especially the Israeli girls, um, the Arabs and the Jews, because they're in a constant situation of having to think their way through very difficult situations with each other. In a lot of cases in this film, for example, you see several cases of girls who are absolutely best friends with each other, who are, by some narratives in their societies, supposed to be enemies.
Mhm.
And and so they experience growing up together, loving each other, feeling that they're together and they understand and support each other, and feeling the pressure of the world around them trying to pull them apart. And of course, that leads, if you can survive that, which not everybody can, but if you can survive it, it leads to becoming a thoughtful and reflective and actually pretty self-actualizing person to be able to handle that. So I had lots of wonderful conversations with them. I found them all very, very moving and lovely, beautiful, emotionally open, warm, excited. Oh, and then at the end, what I also love about it is that in the end, they're also just teenage girls, and
Lots of
they could go,
selfies. Lots of selfies.
yeah, selfies, and like they could go from having the deepest conversation to we'd be sitting together, and then the one of the mothers of one of the girls was sort of the leader on the Israeli side, and very, very strict person too. And they would say, okay, so now girls, you have 15 minutes to get changed and we're going to go into town and get some food. And then 6 or 7 of the girls would say, can we wear our tight, tight leggings? Like this was like a moment after having been talking about deep, painful, profound things that they just went right there, and that's part of what I think makes the film lovely, is that you even though you're in a kind of some heavy subjects, but you're always seeing this completely positive, life affirming, joyful, full of future way that these girls relate to each other. And oh, that was just great.
That's great. Yes, it did read very authentically. That was
Yeah,
fun to watch. So
yeah.
how many girls are a part of this program? And is it also 6 weeks? You'd mentioned 6 weeks for some of the other summer programs.
That we had a 10-day rehearsal period in Tel Aviv, Jaffa, and then we were in Weimar for 8 days, and then we did several concerts in Weimar and the area around Weimar, some other cities around Weimar, Erfurt and other places, and then they went back home. So that was about, I would say, a total of about 3 weeks that particular year.
Okay.
And they came back the following year with some slight differences because some of the girls in the choir had gone to the army in the meantime, so they weren't able to come. And some of the girls on the European side had graduated and they were off in college. So the following year it was also about 3 weeks, and the year after that we weren't able to do it. Last year we couldn't because of Corona, but it's a one of our projects that is still alive and ready to be called back into life anytime that the conditions permit.
So that raises some questions I hadn't even thought of, which so I didn't realize that you would invite the same participants back year on year, but in some cases you have the same people coming back,
For that project, yes.
and not the others.
And well, if we make a project, a specific project, which is to be a performing group or to be a theater piece or something, then of course, having invested time and creativity and energy and money into it, we like to keep it alive. And in fact, we've created, this is brand new, and the launch of this is going to be on March 10th. But we've created an in-house agency to promote these projects, which is called OMA Works. And that's because we saw so many of these projects that we brought into life then not have enough of a life after the project period because they're not always so easy to find funding for. And the projects will come to that, but the issue of funding. So Yiddish Summer Weimar, the framework of it is that it's workshops. And workshops go for generally about a week at a time. And anyone can come to those workshops. They have different levels, beginning, intermediate, advanced, song workshops, dance workshops, instrumental music workshops. There's a week-long festival right in the middle of it, where more like a classical performing arts festival where we perform things. And people who come to those workshops, actually, this is a part of the story of why I wound up staying there, because my expectation was, okay, somebody will come for a year, or maybe they'll come the following year again because 2 summers is enough. But there are people who have been there 15 or 16 years in a row. And it is, in fact, the most serious place for getting a training in Yiddish culture, language, performing arts in the summer in the world. As crazy and unlikely that that would be in Weimar, Germany, which is a place that never even had a Jewish community. But the infrastructure is great because we're doing it during the school vacation. So we have a wonderful music school that we can rent during this period of time that has 10 grand pianos in 10 different rooms, and that's great to have for projects. And the whole city of Weimar has just opened its doors to us. So if you're in Weimar during the period of Yiddish Summer Weimar, you would just think you're in, the Garden of Eden when it comes to Yiddish music. You'll be hearing music coming from every corner and every cafe and every window. It's unbelievable. The whole town becomes that when we're there.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So let's talk about funding.
Okay.
That's probably a bit of a daunting question to answer because you've got so many different programs going on, but can you talk us through it a little bit?
Sure. Well, generally, funding for the arts in Germany is seen as the responsibility of the government rather than private sponsors. So the kind of thing that you see in the United States, if you go to the Metropolitan Opera and you open up your program book and there's 4 pages of donors,
Yeah.
I've never seen that in Germany, not once. Um, so what that means is that there's massive amounts of funding that goes into arts and culture here, um, on a local level, on a state level, and on a national level. And this is an interesting part of the story too, which is a little bit controversial, about the history of the Klezmer music revival or the Yiddish music revival, because I would say arguably the 2 bands that really led that during the 90s were the Klezmatics and Brave Old World. And both of these bands really flourished in Germany in the 90s because at a time where at the end of the 80s and the beginning of the 90s, most Jewish communities in the United States were not yet really enthusiastic about Klezmer music.
Mm-hmm.
But because of state funding here, we could play a concert, a 20 concert tour in 6 weeks. And the presenters would say, I'm presenting this because it's good. I don't care if we get an audience or not. It doesn't matter to me whether we have 10 people or we have 500 people. The 10 people who are there will have the best concert they've ever heard. The other 490 will have missed it. And that's because they had public funding in their back. Now, it's not quite like that anymore. Basically, since the reunification of Germany, funding has gone into other areas instead. But there's still quite a lot of public funding. And the reason we were able to run our festival last year during Corona was because we had public funding to do it. And so realizing that a lot of people had suffered, especially artists, had suffered a lot economically, quite a few people hadn't been able to work for 6 or 7 months, we actually made all of the workshops free last summer.
Wow.
So we had no income from workshops or concerts. We made the income purely on a contribution basis. And by the way, one of the really interesting things there, which people have known about contributions, in the end, we actually wound up bringing in more in contributions than we often bring in from actual ticket sales, because people were just so grateful and generous that they just gave money. But they didn't have to, and there was no stigma coming and saying, I don't have any money, can I be in the workshop? No questions asked. And I think we're the only festival in the world that could do that, because we said to the city funders and the state level funders, that's the state of Thuringia, we said, we're a public culture festival and we have a responsibility to do this festival whether the people can pay for it or not. Especially we have a responsibility to do it and they immediately said yes. Now, that also has to do with a feeling of an obligation to Jewish culture because of what happened to Jews and
Right.
Jewish culture in Germany in the Second World War. So, um, you could say they learned their lesson from that if you want to be generous, or you can be cynical and say that's the Achilles heel. But the conditions are that if you go to a public funder and say we want to do something involved in Jewish culture, you have their attention. They won't necessarily fund everything, but you'll get their attention first, and that's half of the work.
So speaking about work, what a part of this experience making this film was surprisingly easy, and what was surprisingly difficult?
The surprising difficult part is that a week before I was supposed to go to Israel, I fell off of a hiking trail and broke my left foot in 11 places. And so you see me in the film with this gigantic
That
boot.
was one of my questions, actually. Are you feeling better?
Yeah, but in like in 95 to 100-degree temperature with close to 100% humidity and having to walk from the apartment to the place with a freshly broken foot, that was surprisingly difficult. Um, that was really difficult. What was surprisingly easy? Well, also what was difficult was that and you subject in the film. They go into it in the film. The girls from Germany came from a very disciplined choir culture. Um, they all learn to sing soprano, alto, tenor, bass in church from the time they're 6 years old. You can give them a melody and they'll sing a spontaneous four-part harmonization of that melody. If it's a Christmas carol, they know how that goes. And they're part of a choir based in Weimar, which has several thousand members. This is just a tiny fraction of the members of that choir. And in Thuringia alone, there are more than 30,000 people singing in amateur choirs. But those amateur choirs would, if you were to hear one of them on stage, you'd think they were professionals. They hold themselves to a very, very high standard. So they have a standard of rehearsing and preparing and reading music and all of that. And the Israeli girls, it's not like that at all for them. They're getting together and singing wonderful songs that they love and hanging out and lying around on couches. And, you see those scenes. And that was a pretty big cultural clash between the two of them. And I had some difficulties figuring out how to negotiate that. I wasn't the choir leader, I was just the composer. And actually, the girls I had a great relationship with them because I never had to be the disciplinarian. I wasn't conducting the rehearsals, I was the one giving them cool music to sing. But the poor choir directors really had some tough situations sometimes where half of the girls were ready to rehearse and the other half just wanted to go swimming. And it was difficult for me to figure out how to support them. That wasn't easy. Um, Another very difficult moment, which I don't want to give away too much because it's in the film,
No, but
is
I think we're supposed to assume that they've seen the film at this point.
okay, good. Well, then you might remember the scene where the girls are being shown a film by the
Government.
which is yeah, by the government, and I saw that film. And it's very sad that the girls had to watch it and had to agree to it. Again, ostensibly for their own security, but it wasn't that. It was meant to. It was meant to be to make sure that they wouldn't talk at all about politics if they were in Germany. Which, on the one hand, is understandable, but I felt like here these you see in the scene, you see what happens to their faces, and in a way I feel like it's even more powerful that we don't hear what's being said because you've been seeing these full of life girls and they're watching this thing, and I mean in some cases they're asked to deny that their families have been there for 3 or 4 generations. I mean you can think about any teenage girl that um, and forget about what their families had gone through. Imagine a Jewish girl whose family has gone through the Holocaust, and now they're being asked to deny that their family was ever in Poland or something like that as a condition for being able to leave the country the day before after they've been working.
Oh, it was the day before. It was literally the day before.
Literally the day before. So we were rehearsing and working and everything. And each day they were, we don't know if we're going to get to go. We don't know if we're going to get to go. And then came this film. And at that point they were, they had their backs against the wall. They had to say, yeah. But, there too, I have to enormously admire their maturity because I was furious and ready to cry. And they said, look, this is the situation. This is what we deal with all the time. And so, we're concentrating on our friendships and on what we love and on what we do. And we let the politics slide off our backs. And I thought, wow, that is an amazing amount of maturity to be able to handle something like that.
And you could see that reaction in their faces as you were watching that scene.
Yeah,
Very interesting the way you guys
yeah.
put that
We
together.
were, by the way, I have to say, we were a little worried about, even though, we didn't use the film and we didn't use the sound, but even including that scene in the film, because obviously Israel is for everybody a very emotional topic. And we felt we couldn't be honest and present this film without including something about it.
Right.
But we also didn't want to hurt anyone who is so loyal and emotionally involved that any criticism of Israel at all would make them feel, oh, well, this is anti-Semitic or something like that. Because, well, I believe that it's part of what it means to be a democratic government, that you have to be able to take criticism. That's what a democracy lives from dissent. And, there's the idea of the loyal opposition. And we used to know what that was too in the United States, to say I'm loyal to this country. Once there's a new president, I'm 100% behind that president. Unfortunately, that culture is broken down in the United
Right.
States now, and it's broken down in a lot of places around the world. So that was a scene that we were nervous about. And I hope that there was nobody who's listening to this now who saw the film who felt hurt or offended by that scene. That's not the intention.
Right. So speaking of breaking down and bringing back together, are there any other different groups that you would like to see exploring, bringing together? Other different groups from different countries, cultures? What haven't you tapped into that you would really like to do next?
Well, I'd like to tell you a few things that we have done and that are still going on, which,
Awesome.
which one can find out about on our website. If any viewer wants to look up the website, you just have to Google Yiddish Summer Weimar.
Or
W.
Dr. Alan Byrne works really well too.
Oh yeah, okay, Doctor. I never looked that way, but right, there is a Wikipedia
It's right
article
there.
about it. Okay, good, good. So we've done a project, also a project that came out of the other Israel years, which is called the Caravan Orchestra and Choir. And in this, we brought together European musicians together with instrumentalists, with Israeli Jews and Israeli Arab instrumentalists. And actually, that project won the the Shimon Peres Peace Prize a couple of years ago, which is a great honor for us. And to tell you the truth, there are 5 or 6 projects that are alive today in Israel that, of all places in the world, their hour of birth and their cradle and their incubator was Weimar, Germany, of all places in the world. So that project is still in existence. And what we're actually going to do next is called the Yam Orchestra, YAM. Yam is in Yiddish the word for ocean or sea. And so it focuses on the Black Sea area. What the point of this is that in the Ottoman Empire, and this is also something that even many Europeans, so probably most Americans don't know. If you look up a map of the Ottoman Empire, you'll be shocked of what was considered Turkey well into the beginning of the 20th century. And I mean, in the 19th century, I say this a little bit to provoke, but Turkey's next door neighbor was Poland.
Mhm.
So the Ottoman Empire included into the 20th century. It included Romania and Moldavia today. It included parts of Greece. It included Thessaloniki. Thessaloniki was the city in Greece that had the largest Jewish population in the entire Ottoman Empire. I think it might have even been a majority of the population of Thessaloniki were Jews, and Istanbul. And interestingly enough, um, a lot of people think of klezmer musicians as sort of, footloose and fancy free, wandering over fields and listening to the birds. But klezmer musicians were court musicians in the Ottoman Empire. The same way that there are court musicians in the court of Frederick the Great and the court of Louis the 14th and so forth. So we find Yiddish musicians, Yiddish speaking musicians in Istanbul and in Kishinev and in Bucharest in the heart of the Ottoman Empire in 1915.
Wow.
And that's one of the reasons, if we say that Poland is on the border of the Ottoman Empire, you can imagine with Jews being able to go across the border that the whole northeastern part of Europe, which includes today Poland and the Ukraine and White Russia and the Baltic countries, there was culture flowing from the Ottoman Empire through Jewish musicians up into that part of the world too, with the consequence that we find repertoire that was popular in the Ottoman Empire, we find it being recorded in Warsaw in 1925.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's an extremely interesting transcultural moment. And what we're doing is we've put together, again, a new orchestra, which brings together students from a conservatory in Istanbul, students from a conservatory in Thessaloniki, Greece, and students from the conservatory in Weimar. And this is going to be called the YAM Orchestra. And if COVID lets us do it, we'll get started on that this year. And if not, it'll go next year. And one of the things that's different about these projects compared to, I know some of your viewers might know, Daniel Barenboim, who also lives here in Berlin, has a project which is called the East-West Divan Orchestra, which is also Europeans and Israelis, but they get together to play Beethoven. And in our projects, we ask the people who come to the projects to bring with them the songs and the melodies that they heard when they were growing up in their family. And that's the material that we use in these projects. So it's a real, a smorgasbord of the cultures that people bring together. And one of the great things that happens there, and this is the point what I was referring to earlier about how cultural sharing is deeper than political differences, is one person will say, well, I'm going to sing a song that my grandmother used to sing to me, and I'm sure that none of you have ever heard this song before. And then he sings a melody that the Yiddish-speaking people say, what do you mean? This is the song that my grandmother used to sing to me. And the Turkish person will go, what? How is that even possible? I thought all Jews come from Miami or from Los Angeles. What do you mean? How is this possible? And in those moments where you see such deep cultural shared roots, it reframes your feeling about yourself and about the other person. You're much more interested in going into a cultural exchange. I often say, when we talk about intercultural or transcultural things, we often start with the metaphor of a bridge, right? A bridge between cultures. Mm-hmm. But implicit in the idea of a bridge is that there's something that's a gap first that needs to be bridged. And I've said, well, rather than a bridge, what if we think of this as a tunnel, which is already there, or as roots that are already there that just need to be discovered rather than invented out of whole cloth.
I love that.
And that's a much more powerful thing. Many of us know what it's like when you meet somebody, that a long lost cousin that you didn't even know you had. And all of a sudden you go, wow, we're family, and your heart opens up to them, even though you just met them for the first moment, right? That's what happens with these young people when they suddenly sit next to, this happens in Weimar all the time. I know I'm going on and on now, but I'm very moved by this, and this is what my life meaning is about, right? So in Yiddish Summer of Weimar, we have regularly, several 10,000 Syrian refugees came to Germany a few years ago. And among them was half of the Damascus Symphony relocated to Germany. And some of those people found their way to Yiddish Summer Weimar, where they were sitting next to Israelis, and they came from a place where they weren't even allowed to say the word Israel, literally. And the Israelis, who thought all Syrians just want to kill us, and they sit together and make music together for an hour and discover that they love it. And I can tell you dozens of times I've had young people coming up to me sobbing, and it might make me sob, saying, if somebody told me I could sit next to a Jew or I could sit next to a Syrian and play music with them for an hour, I would have said, you're crazy. I don't know what was going on. Yeah, that happens a lot. But you know, sometimes you need a, let's call it politically neutral third place. That's why the Oslo Accords weren't signed in Damascus or in Jerusalem. They were signed in Oslo, because Oslo is a neutral space where everybody has a chance to reframe who they are. A little bit, that's what Weimar
Mhm.
provides for people, an opportunity to reframe who you are, to re-experience who you are without all the pressure of your society looking right over your shoulder and saying, you're not allowed to talk to him, you're not allowed to talk to her.
And through music, which is really like a
And through
direct
music,
pathway to the soul, right?
that's right, through music, through dance, through, I've also seen this happen quite a lot. I don't want people to get the impression this is all about young people. We have people there every year from age of 5 or 6 when they come with their families, all the way into their 90s. And I can remember the first time about 10 years ago in a dance workshop where we just by accident we paired a 14-year-old girl with a 90-year-old guy as dance partners. And the moment we saw it, we went, oh, oh,
Oh,
oh.
how wonderful.
At the first break, we'll split them. And the young girl said, "You're not taking me away from this guy." You know, wow,
Right.
that's amazing too. So there are these lots of inner. That's why. Okay, I talked about Yiddish Summer Weimar, and at some point we created an organization called the Other Music Academy. The Other Music Academy is the big umbrella, the big tent under which Yiddish Summer and all the other projects live. And why it's called Other, it's a focus on the idea of other, because I want people to realize that they create the feeling of the otherness and fear through their own fear. And if they have a chance to actually get to know this supposedly very other person, they might find lots of similarities and lots of things to fall in love with and so forth. And otherness for us is, there are lots of these othernesses. There's the border between men and women. There's the border between young and old. There's the border between heterosexual, homosexual. There's the border between Arab and Israeli, or Arab and Jew. There's the border between Christians and Jews. There's all these different boundaries, right? And each one of those boundaries, on one hand, makes some sense, and on the other hand, is being kept intact by fear. And it's much better to give people the power over those boundaries. Here, the idea is not let's drop all the boundaries. I don't want anybody to think, I don't think the world is a safe place, that you can have no boundaries and everything will work out fine. But it's one thing to have boundaries that you can't call into question because someone told you, here's where you should be afraid, versus being given the tools to figure out the boundaries yourself and set them up yourself and say, I'm comfortable with this much and not with that much. And that's what we're trying to do.
So as we start to approach the end of our conversation, I did want to ask, I suspect through our conversation, I actually already know the answer, but why did you decide in the film not to really show much of the finished product of the concert that would come out of the program at the end?
Actually, that was the filmmaker's decision, and I'm not the filmmaker.
Right.
Yeah, I'm one of the subjects. I'm sort of the project, mm, uh, the impulse, the person who thought of the project and
The
put the music
inspiration.
to it. Yeah, inspiration, and I composed all the music which you hear in the film. Um, I don't know why they made
Oh,
that decision.
interesting. I thought you'd have been included in
No, no,
okay.
because in the end, that's also a question of artistic autonomy and freedom. This is not a PR film. They said from the beginning, hey, we're not making an advertisement. We're going to make a
Right,
film. We want to show what's going on here, warts and all. And I said, of course, that's your artistic freedom. I want you to do that. So, well, I guess, um, I'll speculate here a little bit why they did that. Um, Germany is a place where the phrase happy ending has a tongue-in-cheek quality. Already in the 1930s, if German theater director wanted to make fun of a production, they would say, "Oh, it's das happy end,"
uh-huh.
meaning this is this American thing where everything has to have a happy end. And I think that the filmmakers realized that there were a lot of aspects of this film that are unresolved. And just by showing everybody jumping up and down and loving and kissing each other and making beautiful music at the end, you would communicate the false impression that, oh, everything is fine now. But not everything is fine now.
Right. And also the way they ended it without putting a lot of focus on the big concert, it really made us focus on the journey and the
Right.
conversations and the exploration, which was really the point anyway.
And you hear the music throughout the.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, it was beautiful. So what didn't I ask you about that you normally get asked or that you wanted to talk about that I didn't mention?
Wow, that's an incredible question. I guess what I would like to say is that why it's called the Young Kadyas is because the texts that we used were poems written for children by the Polish Jewish poet Kadia Molodowski.
Hmm.
And she was an extraordinary woman who spent some time in Israel before finally settling in the United States. She was a great poet and a great teacher. And in the same way that I mentioned to you Oslo as a kind of a third place where people can rethink themselves, or Weimar the third place, we thought, well, Kadia Molodowski's poems are in Yiddish. And Yiddish is not the language of the German girls, and it's not the language of the Israeli girls. But interestingly enough, the German girls can understand about 80% of it, but they can't read it.
Hmm.
But the Israeli girls can read it, but they can't understand it. So it's like a perfect place for them to go together, where the Israeli girls can say, this word says, but what does it mean?
Hmm.
And the German girls could say, oh, that word means this, but how did you read it? And it would be like an immediate place where they could bond together. And that's very much in the spirit of everything that we do. I mentioned before that the festival always revolves around questions.
Hmm.
And, I think that education works best when people are joining together to accomplish a very concrete goal. And we have this goal of having this talk right now, and we're cooperating with that. Sometimes you see in winter, one of my favorite things is to see somebody's car get stuck in snow. Probably people in Miami don't have this experience very much. And all of a sudden, people come out of the woodwork and get behind the car and start pushing the car. They don't say, please give me $5 for that. But they recognize, here's a situation where I can help, and they do. And everything that we do in Yiddish Summer, like this issue of taking a Yiddish text so that the girls are drawn into helping each other. That's what we're always trying to do. We're trying to find a subject which is a magnet that inspires and requires cooperation. I think that's it. And then I would just like to say that for anyone who enjoyed this talk or who enjoyed the film, first of all, thank you for showing the film. I think that's great. And I'm really, really delighted that the film is shown in the Miami Film Festival, Jewish Film Festival. Honored that it's shown there. I love Miami the few times that I've been there. I mentioned to you before we talked that I played with Itzhak Perlman there. Is there a hall there that used to be called the Jackie Gleason Center or something?
Very
That's
much.
where,
Yeah, the theater is still there. It's in Miami
yeah,
Beach.
that's
It's
where we
across
played.
from a new Frank Gehry designed symphony hall called the New
Oh,
World Symphony.
great. Well, that's where we played. I remember in 1994 or 1995.
It's a great
And
place.
yeah, I think you're doing great work in the festival. And I'd be very happy if anybody who feels touched by anything that they heard or saw today or in the film would feel like coming to Weimar. And I guess one thing I'd like to say, especially to Jewish audiences, is that I know that a lot of people have the feeling like they'll never go to Germany. I grew up in this culture. You don't buy a VW, and you stay away from everything German. But I have to say that I feel that large parts of Germany learned the lesson from the war and have created a framework now for something like Yiddish Summer to exist, and anyone who would come would have a surprising experience. It's not paradise. There is no paradise until the Messiah comes. The Messiah hasn't come yet, but it's a growing experience for anybody who wants to to take the risk and take it on. I'd be very happy to see anybody there, including you.
Well, I'm definitely taking you up on that. Actually, Berlin is
Okay,
on our short list.
great, great, great. Wonderful.
Thank you so much. So thank you to Dr. Alan Bern from the Young Kadyas for joining us today. Well, and actually from Yiddish Summer of Weimar. And once again, thank you to all of our members, our sponsors, our community partners, volunteers, film lovers, and especially our presenting sponsors, SAGE, the Center for the Advancement of Jewish Education, and the Greater Miami Jewish Federation. Thank you. Thank you so much, our
It was a
audience.
real pleasure.
Thank you, Alan.
Thank
And
you.
thank you all for taking part in this 24th annual Miami Jewish Film Festival. Stay safe, keep watching.